My name is Jonathan. I'm in my late 30s now, a working father, a husband, and, at least on paper, someone who has his life in order. I live a quiet, structured life. I show up on time. I pay my bills. I don't raise my voice. And because of that, people have often mistaken me for someone simple, predictable, emotionally flat, easy to overlook. Most people assume I'm the kind of man who doesn't hold on to things, the kind who lets moments pass, who doesn't keep score. I've heard it said, never unkindly, that I'm low maintenance, that I'm easy, that I don't take things personally, and for a long time, I allowed that perception to stand. Not because it was true, but because correcting it felt unnecessary. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about cutting people off dramatically, or proving anyone wrong in a single explosive moment. It's about something quieter than that. It's about distance, the kind that grows so slowly you don't notice it until it's already shaped who you've become. For years, I ignored my parents' calls. Not out of anger, not out of cruelty, just postponement. Life was busy, work needed me, my children were young. I told myself I'd call them tomorrow, then next week, then Maet, when things slowed down. I dismissed their aging as inconvenient background noise, something theoretical, not urgent, and I didn't realize I was teaching anyone anything by doing that, until one day my children learned to ignore my calls too. This story traces that arc, how small dismissals become habits, how silence can feel harmless when you believe you'll always have time to fix it later, how the roles we accept, son, parent, provider, quietly rewrite themselves when we're not paying attention, and how the mirror eventually turns toward you, showing you not who you were, but what you modeled. What you'll hear isn't dramatized. There are no villains here, no shouting matches, no moment where everything suddenly clicks into place. Just a sequence of realizations, each arriving a little too late to undo the last. I'm not telling this to ask for sympathy or to justify my choices. I'm telling it because honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is the only thing that gives this story meaning. If you've ever believed that silence was neutral, if you've ever assumed the people who love you would always wait, if you've ever postponed connection because life felt more important in the moment, I wonder, who do you think is quietly learning from you right now? For most of my adult life, I was known as the reliable one. Not the exciting one, not the emotional one, just the person who could be counted on to show up, fix what needed fixing, and not ask for much in return. In my family, that reputation formed early and hardened over time. I was the son who didn't cause trouble, the one who adapted, the one who understood that other people's needs came first. When my parents talked about me to others, it was always with a kind of casual confidence. Jonathan's fine, Jonathan's busy, but he's fine, he doesn't need much. And I leaned into that image because it made life smoother. When you're the one who's fine, people don't worry about you. They don't check in too closely. They assume silence means stability. I didn't realize how invisible that made me until much later. In my 20s, when I moved to another city for work, the calls from my parents were frequent at first. Simple conversations, updates about neighbors I barely remembered, questions about whether I was eating well, whether I was sleeping enough. I answered politely, briefly. I was always in between things, meetings, deadlines, commutes. I told myself they understood, and they probably did, at least at first. Over time, the calls became interruptions instead of connections. I'd see their names light up my phone and think, I'll call back later. Not because I didn't care, but because caring felt inefficient. Life demanded momentum, and those conversations felt like pauses I couldn't afford. Weeks passed, then months. I returned calls less often. When I did, they were shorter, more transactional. How are you? Busy. Everything okay? Yeah, same as usual. Same as usual became a shield. It kept things moving. It reassured everyone, without revealing anything. When I married and had children, that pattern deepened. My parents were happy for us, proud even, but they were also peripheral. Grandparents, in theory, voice on speakerphone when time allows. Visits were postponed because the kids were tired, or schedules were full, or work ran late. I didn't frame it as neglect. I framed it as adulthood. From their perspective, I think I was doing well. I had a career, a family, no visible crises. I wasn't calling to ask for help. I wasn't complaining. I wasn't collapsing. So why worry? What I didn't see then was how roles calcify when no one questions them. I was the son who didn't need attention, the son who could be deferred, the son who would still be there later. And because I was always there, even when I wasn't present, my absence didn't register as a loss. That same dynamic followed me into my own household. As a father, I became efficient, loving, yes, but structured. I handled logistics, school schedules, doctor appointments, homework routines. I made sure everything functioned, and in doing so, I taught my children something without ever saying it out loud. I taught them that being dependable mattered more than being available, that showing up physically was enough, that emotional presence could wait until later. They saw me multitasking during conversations, finishing emails while they talked, saying, "Just a minute," more often than I realized. And because children learn patterns faster than intentions, they adapted. They stopped repeating themselves. They filled the silence themselves. They learned when not to interrupt. I didn't notice that shift at first. I was too busy being useful. Looking back now, I understand something that felt invisible at the time. People don't usually disrespect you all at once. They respond to the space you make for them, the version of yourself you present consistently. I presented someone who could wait, someone who didn't need an immediate response, someone whose calls could be returned later, and later always felt like it would come. At that stage of my life, I still believed silence was neutral. It didn't teach anything, that it didn't accumulate interest. I was wrong. But at the time, I thought I was just being practical, mature, responsible. That's who I was to them. And that identity, quiet, capable, endlessly patient, was already shaping consequences I hadn't yet learned how to see. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel important when it happened. That's what makes it difficult to explain now, how something so minor could stay with me for years. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a small decision made without much thought that quietly changed how I saw things. It was a weekday evening. I remember because I was still at the office, the building mostly empty, lights dimmed automatically to save power. My phone buzzed on the desk, my mother's name. I looked at it, considered answering, then glanced at the clock. I told myself I'd call back once I finished what I was doing. By the time I left the office, the call had faded into the background of the day. Traffic, groceries, a tired conversation with my wife about schedules and bills. I didn't call back that night. The next morning, there was a voicemail, short, careful, the kind of message people leave when they don't want to sound like they're asking for too much. Just wanted to hear your voice. Call when you can. There was something in her tone, measured, almost rehearsed, that caught my attention. Not sadness exactly, more like an adjustment, as if she were already recalibrating expectations. I still didn't call right away. That weekend, I finally did. The conversation was fine, pleasant. She didn't mention the missed call, didn't bring up the voicemail. And that's when the cut happened. Not because she said something, but because she didn't. The silence filled itself in my mind. I realized she had learned not to expect immediacy from me. That she had already softened her reach, just a little, to avoid being disappointed. And instead of unsettling me, that realization brought a strange sense of relief. Good, I thought. She understands. That's how the first small cut formed, not between us, but inside me. From then on, the pattern reinforced itself. Calls came. I answered when it was convenient. When I didn't, no one pressed. My parents adjusted. They always had. They were careful not to intrude on my busy life. And the absence of conflict convinced me everything was fine. Around the same time, I noticed similar moments elsewhere. At work, my input was often assumed rather than requested. Decisions were made with the expectation that I'd support them. When something went wrong, it landed on my desk, not because I caused it, but because I was reliable enough to fix it quietly. No one thanked me. No one dismissed me either. They just expected me. I told myself that was respect. At home, my children were still young, but patterns were already forming. I'd come home tired, sit at the table with my laptop open, half listening as they talked. When they repeated themselves, I'd smile and say, "Sorry, what was that?" Eventually, they stopped repeating. The first time my oldest chose not to tell me something until later, I barely noticed. It wasn't a secret, just a story that found a different audience first. My wife, a friend, someone who seemed more available in that moment. No one pointed it out. No one accused me of anything. That's the dangerous part of subtle shifts. They don't announce themselves. Everyone else around me ignored these moments completely. To them, nothing was wrong. Life was moving forward. Responsibilities were being met. There were no crises. But I remembered them. I remembered the way my mother's voice had changed in that voicemail. The way my kids glanced at me before deciding whether to speak. The way people stopped waiting for my attention and learned to proceed without it. At the time, I still believed I was in control of my silence, that I was choosing efficiency over sentimentality, that these were small, harmless trade-offs. What I didn't understand yet was that every unreturned call, every postponed conversation was a lesson, not a punishment, not a protest. A lesson in how long someone should wait before moving on. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't need to be taught twice. That's how normalization works, not by making things hurt less, but by making them familiar enough that you stop reacting. The missed calls, the delayed replies, the quiet adjustments everyone made around me became part of the background rhythm of my life. And because no one complained, I assumed no one was harmed. My parents stopped calling as often. When they did, it was usually at predictable times, almost scheduled. Sunday afternoons, early evenings, windows, they believed, were safest. If I didn't answer, they didn't follow up, no second call, no message asking if everything was okay. I told myself that was mutual respect. In reality, it was an accommodation. When I did speak to them, the conversations were efficient. Updates exchanged like bullet points. Health was fine. The weather was cold. Neighbors were the same. I noticed they asked fewer questions about my inner life. Fewer whys. Fewer pauses waiting for me to elaborate. They were learning how to talk to the version of me I presented, and I was learning how easy it was to accept that. At work, the pattern deepened. I became the man people looped in after decisions were already made. The one copied on emails instead of consulted in meetings. Not excluded, just assumed. When I raised concerns, they were met with polite nods and little follow-through. Good point, someone would say. We'll keep that in mind. And then nothing would change. I didn't push. I told myself it wasn't worth the energy, that my job was to execute, not to insist on being heard. That's how disrespect hides. It wears the costume of practicality. At home, my children grew older and more independent. They learned my rhythms well. They knew when I was reachable and when I wasn't. They learned that my attention was a finite resource, something to be requested carefully. Sometimes, they didn't request it at all. I'd find out about things after the fact. A school project was completed. A small conflict was resolved. A worry processed without me. None of it is dramatic. None of it is intentional exclusion, just adaptation. And each time, I rationalized it. They're growing up. They don't need me as much. This is normal. Rationalization is comforting because it removes responsibility. It frames distance as inevitability instead of consequence. I normalized it everywhere. When my parents mentioned being tired more often, I brushed past it. When they talked about doctor's visits, I listened but didn't linger. Aging was happening to them, not around me. I still had time. When my children didn't respond immediately to my messages, I told myself they were busy. When they replied with short answers, I assumed that was just how kids communicated now. I never asked if I was experiencing the echo of my own behavior. The truth is, I had trained everyone around me to expect less of my presence. And because expectations were lower, no one felt the need to demand more. That's the quiet danger of being the easy one. People don't fear losing you because they don't feel you fully when you're there. I wasn't being shouted over. I wasn't being insulted. I wasn't being mistreated in any obvious way. I was being adjusted around, and because that adjustment was subtle, I accepted it as the cost of being dependable, of being mature, of not making things about myself. I told myself staying quiet was a virtue. That absorbing small dismissals was a strength. That reaction would be petty. So I stayed quiet. What I didn't realize was that silence doesn't preserve dignity by default. Sometimes, it just confirms to others that your absence carries no weight. And once that belief sets in, reversing it requires more than words. It requires change. But at this stage, I wasn't ready to see that yet. I still believed I could speak up later. Reconnect later, reclaim presence later. Later felt infinite, and that belief, the assumption of unlimited time and unlimited patience, was the most dangerous normalization of all. Roles don't arrive with announcements. No one sits you down and explains the part you've been cast in. They emerge quietly, shaped by repetition, reinforced by convenience. And once they're set, people interact with the role instead of the person. By the time I noticed mine, it had already hardened. I was the stabilizer, the one who would adjust, compensate, and absorb, the one who didn't complicate things by needing too much. In meetings, I was the person others spoke around, not because my opinion lacked value, but because it was assumed I'd adapt to whatever direction was chosen. At home, I was the provider and the planner, the quiet constant, the father who made sure everything worked, but didn't always stop to ask how it felt. And to my parents, I was the successful son, the proof that they'd done something right. A finished project in a way, someone whose life no longer required close tending. None of these roles was malicious. That's important to say. No one was trying to diminish me. They were responding to what I consistently offered: reliability without demand, presence without insistence. People don't usually take advantage of you because they're cruel. They do it because the structure allows it. I noticed it most clearly during a family visit. My parents had come to stay with us for a few days. Nothing unusual. They were polite guests, careful not to intrude. My mother cooked, despite our protests. My father fixed a loose cabinet hinge without being asked. I went about my routine: work calls, errands, bedtime logistics. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized something uncomfortable. No one had asked how I was. Not out of neglect, out of assumption. They assumed I was fine because I always was. Because that's the role I'd played for years. The son who didn't need checking on. The man whose inner life was stable, unremarkable, self-sustaining. Even my children mirrored it. They hugged their grandparents, showed them drawings, and asked questions. With me, they interacted efficiently. Updates, requests, logistics. Love was there, but it was structured, contained. I had become a functional presence rather than an emotional one, and I had helped build that version of myself. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. I remember standing in the kitchen late one night, the house quiet, lights dimmed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. My parents are asleep in the guest room. My children are upstairs. My wife is already in bed. I felt oddly unnecessary. Not unimportant, not unloved, just replaceable in certain ways. As if the system would continue to function, even if my emotional input was removed. And that scared me more than any open conflict ever could have, because roles, once assigned, are difficult to renegotiate without disrupting the entire structure, and disruption was something I had spent my life avoiding. So instead of confronting it, I observed it. I watched how often decisions were made without me, how rarely anyone waited for my response, how quickly people adjusted when I wasn't immediately available. I told myself this was the price of being steady. That steadiness required sacrifice, that this was what adulthood looked like. But deep down, something had shifted. I realized I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because I'd made myself easy to overlook. And the most uncomfortable part was this: everyone was behaving exactly as I had trained them to behave. That meant the responsibility, quiet as it was, rested with me. At that point, I still didn't know what I would do with that awareness. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting a confrontation. But I had stopped assuming the role was permanent. I had begun to understand it as a choice. And once you see a role as a choice, you can no longer pretend you're trapped in it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no harsh sentence that stayed with me. No dramatic event forced clarity. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, so unremarkable that I almost missed it. I was driving home from work earlier than usual. Traffic was light. The radio was off. My phone, resting in the console, buzzed once. I didn't look at it right away. I was enjoying the quiet. When I did glance down at a red light, I saw my father's name. A missed call. No voicemail yet. My first instinct was familiar. I'll call him later. And then, almost without effort, I imagined myself not calling back at all. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing would happen if I didn't. No follow-up call, no message, no urgency. That certainty landed heavier than the missed call itself. I sat there at the light, watching it change, and realized something that unsettled me deeply. My absence had become predictable. Not dramatic, not painful enough to protest. Predictable. When I got home, my children were already in their rooms. My wife mentioned they had homework, dinner plans, and their own routines unfolding smoothly without me. I nodded, moved through the house, and did what needed to be done. Later that evening, I called my father back. The conversation was short. He sounded relieved, but not surprised. Grateful, but careful. Near the end, he said something simple. "We didn't want to bother you." It wasn't an accusation, it was a conclusion. After we hung up, I sat alone and replayed that sentence in my head. We didn't want to bother you. I had become someone people managed around. That was the moment something shifted, not outwardly, but internally. I stopped seeing my silence as passive. I stopped seeing it as neutral. I saw it as communicative. Every delay said something. Every postponed response taught something. Every absence reinforced an expectation. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never seriously considered. What am I teaching my children about how to treat me? Not intentionally, not through lectures or rules, through repetition. They had watched me deprioritize my parents. They had absorbed the idea that important people could wait, that love was stable enough to be postponed indefinitely. I had dismissed my parents' aging as inconvenient, something to deal with later, and now I was watching my own reflection grow distant in my children. That realization didn't make me defensive. It made me quiet in a different way. I didn't decide to confront anyone. I didn't vow to change overnight. I didn't make promises to myself I couldn't keep. I just stopped assuming time would always smooth things out. I began to notice how often I was absent by choice, not necessity, how often I prioritized efficiency over connection, how rarely I allowed myself to be inconvenient to others. And I wondered, calmly, honestly, what would happen if I stopped playing the role that made everything easy for everyone else. Not out of spite, not to teach a lesson, but to see what remained when I withdrew the quiet labor of constant accommodation. That was the day silence stopped being automatic. It became deliberate, and when silence becomes a choice, it stops being harmless. After that day, nothing on the surface changed. That's the part most people don't understand when they hear stories like this. There was no announcement, no sudden withdrawal, no dramatic shift in behavior that anyone could point to and say, that's when it started. I kept doing what I'd always done. I went to work. I showed up for my family. I answered calls when they came. I returned messages eventually. From the outside, I was still reliable, still calm, still present enough. But internally, something fundamental had changed. I stopped filling the gaps. When conversations drifted toward logistics, I let them stay there. I didn't add emotional color. I didn't compensate for pauses. I noticed how often I used to bridge silences so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable, and I let those silences stand. At work, when decisions were made without my input, I didn't rush to correct them. I executed exactly what was asked. No more, no less. When people assumed I'd stay late or fix problems quietly, I didn't volunteer unless explicitly requested. They mistook this for ease, for flexibility, for weakness. At home, I became more observant than participatory. I listened more than I spoke. When my children were distracted or brief with me, I didn't chase their attention. I responded in kind, warm, but not insistent. I wasn't punishing them. I was matching the pattern they had learned. And because I didn't complain, no one noticed. That's the irony of quiet change. People only react to noise. Silence is interpreted as consent. My parents, especially, seemed relieved. Fewer calls, less pressure. When we did speak, the conversations were polite and light. They no longer tried to pull me into long discussions. They had learned not to expect that. I didn't correct them. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I needed to see something clearly, how people behave when you stop doing the emotional labor for them. What surprised me was how quickly everyone adapted. At work, my reduced initiative was barely remarked upon. Projects continued. Meetings moved on. My absence from certain discussions didn't slow anything down. At home, routines filled themselves. My children leaned more into their own worlds. My wife carried on, competent and capable, assuming I was fine because I always was. The system was stable without my extra effort, and that realization was both freeing and devastating, because it confirmed something I had avoided admitting. Much of what I contributed emotionally was invisible because it wasn't required to keep things running. I wasn't missed in the moment. I was only noticed when something broke. And since nothing had broken yet, no one saw the change. That's when I understood the difference between being valued and being useful. Usefulness keeps you busy. Value makes you irreplaceable. I had built a life where I was indispensable operationally, but optional emotionally. Silence, once strategic, reveals structure. It shows you where your presence actually matters. And as I observed, quietly, patiently, I began to document these patterns, not on paper, but in my mind. Who reached out first? Who followed up? Who adjusted without question? I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was learning. Because before you decide what to do next, you need to understand the system you're part of. You need to know which absences create ripples. and which ones barely register. And I was beginning to see, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly how much of my absence had already been normalized. What they never noticed was that I had started paying attention in a way I never had before. Not emotionally, strategically. When you stop reacting, you gain space. And in that space, patterns become visible. I began to see how often my presence had been assumed rather than requested. How frequently my effort filled gaps that no one acknowledged because they didn't realize the gap existed. I noticed who reached out when I went quiet and who didn't, who followed up and who simply adjusted, who asked questions and who stopped expecting answers. At work, I watched how projects flowed without my early input, how my name appeared later in email threads. Often when something needed smoothing over, I kept notes, mental ones, about timelines, dependencies, and decision makers. I learned which choices mattered and which were cosmetic. I wasn't trying to control anything, I was mapping it. At home, I observed the same thing, my children's routines, their rhythms, when they naturally gravitated toward me, and when they didn't. I paid attention to what drew them in and what made them drift away. I noticed that when I stopped interrupting myself for work, they lingered a little longer. When I didn't chase their attention, they sometimes circled back on their own. Not always, but enough to matter. With my parents, the pattern was clearest. They called less. When they did, it was tentative. Their tone had changed over the years from expectation to hope. And now, without me reinforcing their efforts, it softened further into acceptance. I didn't correct it. I didn't reassure them. I needed to understand something first, whether my presence was still something they wanted or just something they had learned not to expect. That distinction matters, because people will often say they want you, but behave as though they've already moved on, and behavior tells the truth long before words catch up. I began to see that much of my life had been built on quiet agreements no one remembered making. Agreements like, Jonathan will handle it, Jonathan doesn't mind, Jonathan will adapt. When I stopped upholding those agreements, no one renegotiated them. They simply found workarounds. And that told me everything. Preparation, in this context, didn't look like plotting or gathering evidence. It looked like a restraint, like patience, like allowing the system to reveal itself without interference. I learned which relationships depended on my initiative to survive, and which ones could coast indefinitely without it. I learned that availability creates dependency, but boundaries create clarity. And I learned something else, something harder to admit. I had been afraid of discovering how little effort it might take for some people to let me fade into the background, so I had stayed visible by habit. Now, I was stepping back by choice. They never noticed the shift because I didn't announce it, I didn't dramatize it, I didn't demand acknowledgement. I simply stopped compensating. And in doing so, I was quietly gathering the most valuable information of all. Not who said they cared, but who acted as if my presence made a difference. That knowledge doesn't come with fireworks. It arrives slowly, through repetition, through absence. But once you have it, you can't unsee it. And I was getting very close to understanding exactly what leverage I did and didn't have. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It arrived, the way most truths do, when you've been quietly preparing for them, without drama, without emotion, just a clear, internal click. A recognition that something you suspected had finally confirmed itself. It happened on a week when no one reached out. Not my parents, not my children, beyond logistics, not anyone from work beyond routine messages. There was nothing wrong, no crisis, no conflict, just silence. And in that silence, I realized something with absolute clarity. My absence did not create urgency, it created efficiency. Everyone adjusted smoothly, life continued. Systems compensated, schedules filled in the gaps. I wasn't missed, I was absorbed. That was the private reveal. Not that I didn't matter, but that the way I mattered had been limited to function. I had become a background structure, like plumbing or electricity, essential, but unnoticed unless it failed. And because I hadn't failed, no one checked. That realization could have broken me if I had still been seeking validation, but by then I wasn't. I felt calmer, cleaner, clarity. I understood that emotional presence isn't something you can demand retroactively. You either build it consistently or you don't, and I had built reliability instead. I also understood something else, something more uncomfortable. My parents had aged quietly because I had allowed them to. I had made their gradual slowing feel non-urgent by always being busy, but fine. I had taught them not to lean on me. Now, I was watching my children do the same. They didn't ignore me out of rebellion. They ignored me out of respect for the version of me I had modeled. Self-contained, unavailable, always occupied. This wasn't cruelty, it was an inheritance. That's when I found my leverage, not over others, but over myself. I realized I didn't need to confront anyone to change the trajectory. I didn't need apologies or explanations. I needed to decide what kind of presence I would be going forward. Because once you see that your absence doesn't disrupt anything, you have a choice. Fade quietly or re-enter deliberately. Both require courage. One maintains comfort, the other risks rejection. I sat with that for a long time. Not days, weeks. I imagined continuing as I was. Being useful, being steady, being emotionally optional. It was safe, familiar, predictable. And then I imagined something else. Withdrawing my quiet labor completely. Not angrily, not suddenly, just fully. Letting the consequences surface on their own timeline. Not as punishment, but as truth. That was the real reveal. I didn't have to prove anything. I didn't have to explain myself. I only had to stop protecting others from the natural results of my absence. And once I saw that clearly, the decision in front of me became unavoidable. Once you see the structure clearly, indecision becomes its own choice. I had reached the point where continuing as before would no longer be neutral. It would be an endorsement of a role I now understood too well, and changing it would mean accepting consequences I couldn't fully predict. There were options in front of me. I could reassert myself gently, start calling more, initiating conversations, making myself emotionally available again. I could explain, carefully, how distance had formed, and hope others would meet me halfway. I could confront it directly, name the pattern, express the hurt, ask for change. That path promised clarity, but risked defensiveness. People don't like being told they've taken something for granted. Or I could do something quieter, something irreversible in its own way. I could stop maintaining the illusion of constant availability altogether, not dramatically, not with ultimatums, but by aligning my actions fully with what had already been normalized. I thought about my parents, how they had learned not to lean on me, how my absence had become expected. Re-entering loudly now would feel jarring, almost selfish. It would ask them to unlearn years of adaptation for my sudden clarity. I thought about my children, how they had grown accustomed to my partial presence, how many abrupt emotional shifts might feel confusing, even intrusive. And I thought about myself, about how often I had silenced my own needs to preserve harmony, how often I had mistaken being needed for being valued. I realized something uncomfortable but honest. I didn't want to argue my way back into relevance. I wanted to know who would notice if I simply stopped. So I chose the irreversible option. I decided to move in full alignment with the role everyone already believed I occupied. Self-sufficient, emotionally contained, non-demanding, and remove the extra effort that made that role comfortable for others. I would no longer initiate contact out of obligation. I would no longer bridge emotional gaps automatically. I would no longer compensate for others' distance, not as a tactic, as a truth. If someone reached out, I would respond, calmly, respectfully. If they didn't, I would let the silence speak without interruption. This wasn't withdrawal, it was honesty. I understood that once I stopped protecting people from the consequences of emotional distance, some relationships would change permanently. Some might fracture, others might reveal their limits. And I accepted that. Because pretending closeness exists when it doesn't is its own kind of dishonesty. I wasn't choosing disappearance. I was choosing integrity. And that choice, once made, couldn't be undone by apology or explanation. It would unfold slowly, quietly, through absence and response. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't need to. The system already knew how to function without my full presence. Now, it would learn what that actually meant. When you decide to move quietly, the most important thing is consistency. Not drama, not speed, consistency. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't explain a shift. I simply aligned my behavior with the limits I had already stopped enforcing for others. What changed wasn't visibility, it was availability. At work, I became precise. I documented processes I had previously carried out in my head. I clarified responsibilities instead of absorbing ambiguity. When tasks fell outside my role, I asked simple questions. Who owns this? What's the priority? What's the timeline? I stopped anticipating problems before they were voiced. The result was subtle, but immediate. People noticed small delays, not enough to complain, but enough to feel. Projects still moved forward, just without the invisible cushioning I had always provided. No one confronted me. They adjusted. At home, the changes were even quieter. I maintained routines, but I stopped overfunctioning. If my children didn't respond to a message, I didn't follow up. If they were distracted during conversations, I didn't compete for their attention. I didn't withdraw affection, I withdrew the pursuit. With my wife, I communicated clearly but briefly. No passive hints, no emotional over-explaining. When something mattered, I said so once. When it didn't, I let it pass. That alone changed the tone. With my parents, I let calls come to me. When they didn't, I didn't fill the gap. Birthdays were acknowledged, holidays marked. But without excess. I didn't perform closeness, I reflected on it. This wasn't coldness, it was accurate. And the most striking part was how long it took anyone to notice. Days passed, then weeks. Life continued. The absence of my extra effort didn't create an immediate crisis. It created a slow imbalance, a subtle discomfort. Things still worked, but not as smoothly. And because there was no obvious cause, no one knew what to address. That's the power of quiet change. It doesn't trigger defense. It invites observation. I stayed calm. I stayed present when present. I didn't justify myself. I understood something then. People often confuse emotional availability with stability. They assume the person who never demands anything will never withdraw anything either. They forget that even silence is something you give. I had stopped giving it freely. And slowly, without my involvement, the consequences began to surface. The consequences didn't arrive loudly. They never do when you've removed yourself quietly. They arrive in confusion first, a sense that something is off, without a clear reason why. At work, it showed up in hesitation. People double-checked things they used to assume I'd handle. Questions were asked later than usual. Small decisions stalled, waiting for ownership that no one realized I had been providing silently for years. I noticed it in meetings. Pauses, where someone would glance in my direction, then continue without saying anything. Not an accusation, not blame. Just a flicker of uncertainty. Things still worked, but they worked more slowly. At home, the shift was more emotional than logistical. My children began checking in with me in small ways. Not with urgency, but with curiosity. A comment here, a question there, moments that felt like testing the distance, seeing whether I was still where they'd left me. I didn't rush to close that distance. I let them approach at their own pace. That restraint was difficult. Every instinct told me to reinsert myself, to reassure them, to smooth things over. But I had learned that reassurance given too early only preserves the pattern. With my parents, the change was unmistakable. My mother called twice in 1 week. That hadn't happened in years. The first time, I missed it. The second time, I answered. Her voice carried something I hadn't heard before, uncertainty edged with concern. "We haven't talked in a while," she said carefully. "I just wanted to check in. Not an accusation, not guilt. Awareness." I responded warmly, but I didn't overcompensate. I didn't apologize for the gap. I didn't rush to explain myself. I let the silence between her calls stand as its own message, and for the first time, she felt it. That's when I understood something important. People don't feel loss when you disappear suddenly. They feel it when they realize you're no longer compensating for their distance. The consequences weren't dramatic. No one lashed out. No one demanded answers. But the equilibrium had shifted. At work, I was no longer assumed. At home, I was no longer background. With my parents, I was no longer guaranteed. And because I hadn't announced anything, no one could point to a cause. They could only respond to the effect. This stage was uncomfortable, not because of conflict, but because of ambiguity. People don't like not knowing where they stand. I stayed calm through it all. Because once consequences begin, your job is not to explain them away. It's to let them clarify what words never could. By the time people realized something needed fixing, they weren't sure what it was. That's the quiet cruelty of delayed awareness. You feel the loss before you understand the cause. And once you understand it, you realize how long it's been forming. My parents were the first to feel it fully. Calls became more frequent, but also more tentative. My mother began asking questions she hadn't asked in years, about my health, my mood, my work. Questions that suggested she was trying to locate me emotionally, not just confirm I still existed. My father's voice changed too, less certainty, more pauses. They didn't accuse me of being distant, they framed it differently. You seem busy lately. We don't want to interrupt. We just wanted to hear how you're doing. Each sentence carried the same subtext. We're not sure where we fit anymore. But by then, the old rhythm couldn't be restored with a few longer calls. They were trying to repair a bridge after years of learning not to cross it. With my children, the realization came in fragments. They started asking me things they used to tell me without hesitation. They waited for permission instead of assuming access. When I didn't immediately engage, they didn't push, they withdrew. That's when I saw it clearly. They weren't ignoring me. They were protecting themselves from indifference. And the hardest part was knowing I had taught them how. At work, there were meetings, subtle ones, where my role was discussed without being named. Responsibilities were clarified. Processes reassigned. I was still respected, but no longer central. No one asked me how I felt about that. They assumed, as always, that I was fine. That assumption used to comfort me. Now, it felt final. Attempts to fix things began appearing, not directly, but through gestures. An invitation was extended a little more warmly, a question asked with extra care, a call placed at a different time, as if timing alone might restore closeness. But gestures can't undo years of adaptation. By the time people try to repair distance, they're often responding to discomfort, not understanding. They want the feeling to go away, not the structure to change. And I knew that if I stepped back into my old role now, if I reassured too quickly, filled the gaps again, I would only confirm the lesson they had already learned, that I would always return to accommodate them. So I didn't. Not out of spite, out of honesty. I remained open, but not eager, present, but not overextended. I answered what was asked, but I didn't offer what hadn't been requested. And that's when it became clear that some things couldn't be fixed, only acknowledged. My parents couldn't rewind time to the years I had emotionally stepped away. My children couldn't unlearn the habit of self-containment. My workplace couldn't reinsert me into a role that had already been redistributed. The panic, when it came, was quiet. It showed up as regret wrapped in politeness, as confusion masked by kindness, as people are trying to reestablish a connection without naming the distance that had made it necessary. And because no one named it, nothing truly changed. By then, it was too late to fix things the old way. Only a different way remained. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. No one raised their voice, no one listed grievances. There were no accusations to defend against, no dramatic confessions to respond to. Just a moment where silence could no longer do all the work on its own. It was my parents who initiated it. They asked if we could talk, really talk. Not about schedules or holidays, or surface updates. Just talk. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one I'd stood beside years earlier, feeling unnecessary. The light was soft, the room was quiet, everything about the setting suggested safety. My mother spoke first. "You've changed," she said gently. "Or maybe we just didn't notice sooner." I didn't rush to deny it. I didn't rush to explain. I let the truth arrive slowly. "I didn't change suddenly," I said. "I just stopped compensating." That sentence hung in the air longer than anything else said that evening. They looked confused, not defensive. That mattered. I told them, calmly, without blame, how I had learned not to call, how I had learned they would adapt, how their careful distance had taught me it was okay to stay away. I didn't accuse them of neglect. I described patterns. And then I said the part that mattered most. I assumed there would always be time. My father nodded slowly. My mother's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. They didn't argue. They didn't explain themselves away. They admitted something I hadn't expected to hear. "We thought you didn't need us anymore." That was the moment I understood how mutual the misunderstanding had been. With my children, the confrontation was even quieter. There was no formal conversation, just moments, small, deliberate ones, where I acknowledged distance without trying to erase it. "I know I haven't always been present," I told them once, simply. "That's on me." No lecture, no promise to change everything overnight. Just ownership. They didn't rush toward me. They didn't pull away either. They absorbed the statement the way children do, carefully, without performance. And that was enough. The key difference this time was restraint. I didn't try to fix everything. I didn't rush to rebuild closeness on my timeline. I allowed the discomfort to exist without smoothing it over. Because true confrontation isn't loud. It's the moment you stop denying what's already visible. And once that happens, you don't need to win. You just need to stand still long enough for the truth to settle. I am quieter now, but not withdrawn. There's a difference I didn't understand before. Silence used to be something that happened to me, something I drifted into while telling myself it didn't matter. Now, it's something I choose with intention. I no longer confuse being dependable with being invisible. At work, I'm clear about what I own and what I don't. I speak when it matters. I don't fill space just to be useful. And because of that, when I do speak, people listen differently. Not with surprise, with attention. At home, my presence is narrower but deeper. I don't try to be everywhere at once. I don't multitask conversations. When my children talk to me now, I give them the part of me that used to be scattered across obligations. Not constantly, not perfectly, but honestly. They're still cautious sometimes. Distance doesn't disappear just because it's acknowledged. But trust, I've learned, doesn't need urgency. It needs consistency. With my parents, the relationship has settled into something more fragile and more real. We talk less often than they might want, and more honestly than we used to. There are pauses in our conversations now that aren't rushed past. Moments where we acknowledge age, time, regret, without trying to fix any of it. I don't pretend we can reclaim what we didn't protect. I also don't punish myself for it anymore. The biggest change, though, is internal. I no longer measure my worth by how smoothly things run around me. I don't assume that being needed means being valued, or that being quiet means being strong. I've learned that presence is not something you demonstrate once and bank forever. It's something you renew, or you lose it slowly. And I've made peace with the parts of my life that didn't survive that learning. There's no bitterness here, no triumph, just clarity. I know who I am now, not as a role, but as a person with limits, needs, and responsibility for how I show up. And that knowledge, once earned, doesn't need to be proven to anyone else. There's a quiet assumption many of us carry without realizing it, that the people who love us will always be there, that time is flexible, that distance can be repaired whenever we finally slow down. I believed that for a long time. I believed I could ignore my parents' calls without consequence because love was stable and history was deep. I believed dismissing their aging as inconvenient was practical, not cruel. I believed my children would always wait for me to become fully present because I was their father. None of those beliefs was malicious. They were just unexamined. What I learned, slowly and without drama, is that absence teaches as much as presence. Every time you postpone a conversation, you're modeling priority. Every time you say later, you're teaching someone how long to wait. And the lesson doesn't stop with you. My parents learned not to reach. My children learned not to wait. And I learned what it feels like to see your own reflection grow distant in the people you love. There was no villain in this story. No single moment where everything went wrong. Just years of quiet choices that added up. If there's a moral here, it isn't always be available or never put yourself first. It's this: don't confuse stability with permanence. Relationships don't usually break. They think, they stretch, they adjust, until one day you realize they've been living without the part of you that mattered most. Silence isn't neutral, reliability isn't intimacy, and being needed isn't the same as being known. The hardest truth I had to accept was that no one stole closeness from me. I gave it away, one postponement at a time. But the most hopeful truth is this: awareness changes how you move forward, even if it can't rewrite the past. You can still choose presence, deliberate, imperfect, honest presence, from this moment on. And maybe that's enough. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever realized, too late, that someone learned how to live without your attention? Or that you learned to live without someone else's? I'm curious what that moment looked like for you.